Thanks very much for that kind introduction. As Chris said, my name's Dom Hallas. I run an organisation called the Coalition for a Digital Economy, or Coadec for short. And as a starting point, I think the big question that everyone always asks when we have this conversation is why are we doing this? Who are we? What are we doing? And so Coadec's the lobby group for tech startups in the UK, so we spend all of our time talking to government about what policy impacts the startup ecosystem, how we can help engage them better, how we can make sure that startups like yourselves and businesses around the country are able to better engage their way into government policy. So we were founded back in 2010 by Mike Butcher, who edits TechCrunch, and a guy called Jeff Lynn, who founded Seeders, the equity crowdfunding platform. And so since 2010, so for the past 9 years, we've spent our time working across what we think are the three main issues and what startups consistently tell us are the three main issues that impact them in terms of government policy. So access to talent, so immigration policy and skills policy, access to finance, so making sure you guys have the capital that you need to grow and scale, and then the regulatory agenda, which is everything from data protection right through to online harms, AI policy, and basically anything else that the government's rustling up in the digital policy space that could impact on you guys. And obviously, all of those things are hugely impacted by our exit from the European Union, which is why I'm here today. Just quickly about me, so I took over at Coadec a year and a half ago, but before that, and probably most pertinent for our conversation today, I spent a year working at the Brexit Ministry, at DEXU, running diplomatic strategy for Southern Europe. Mostly that entailed being shouted at by the Italian ambassador, and the joke that I usually say, people always say to me when I worked in diplomatic strategy, what diplomatic strategy did the government have? Which is a fair point at this stage in the negotiations. And so we put together this document that all of you have on your chairs. We'll put out the soft copy as well. I'll get Chris to send an email around to everyone who's signed up, which is really about trying to condense the information about particularly a no-deal Brexit. So if we leave with no deal, whether that's on the 31st of October or whether that's later on, and what you can do as startups to prepare for that. What are the things that will most impact you? Because one of the things that we've heard time and again over the course of the past 3 years as we've been engaging people over Brexit is as you go through the kind of government website and you click through and explain what your business does, what understandably the government website has to do is list every possible thing that could ever impact your company. And there's a reason for that. It's because they're going to get it in the neck if they don't list every single possibility, even if it's a 0.001% chance of happening to your particular company. So what we've tried to do is condense this document into the top 10 things that we've heard time and again from startups are impacting them around the country. And what I'll do is I'll go through 3 of those, the top 3 that we hear time and again in a little bit more detail today, but I'm happy to take questions on the other 10 and anything else that you might have issues on. So this piece of guidance, the first thing to say about it is that it is not a substitute for speaking to a lawyer. Right? It's not. We have lawyers in the room somewhere, Chris. Right?
You do. Yeah.
We do have lawyers in the room. So, but it's not a substitute for speaking to a lawyer, and that's for 2 reasons. There's 2 reasons for that. We're not going to have all the answers, and the first is because you have a myriad of businesses in different verticals, and you're doing different exciting things. And when you have questions for us now, we're not going to have all the answers. That's the reality. And the second reason is, frankly, there's still an awful lot of uncertainty. And so we're not going to know exactly what's going to happen, but one of the things that we'll try and do in the Q&A, and we'll be totally honest with you about, is where we don't have the answers and we don't know exactly what's going to happen, we'll tell you. And where you guys have questions that we don't have answers for, we also have Paul here from DCMS as well, from the Digital Ministry, and we'll make sure that it's recorded and taken away, and we'll go away and try and get answers for you on the questions that you care about. But we'll be totally frank where there genuinely aren't answers available. So these are the 10 things that we came up with. And I'll pull this slide back up once we get to the sort of end of the presentation section, and you can ask any questions on the different bits and bobs. But I want to just talk about 3 of them in a little bit more detail, and that's data protection and data flows, employment, immigration and visas, and then Horizon 2020 and R&D funding, because they're the 3 things that we've heard time and again from companies as we've gone around the UK. So I've given this same broad presentation 6 or 7 times at this point, but also through our conversations prior to sort of having these discussions, that they're the most impacted by and the most concerned about. So the first one is data protection and data flows. The main thing to know about this is if you have European clients or European suppliers and you move data back, and particularly from the European Union to the United Kingdom, the legal basis on which that data flows from the EU to the UK will have to change. All right, so at the moment, you can happily move stuff back and forth, but after we leave the European Union, you need to put in a new structure to allow that data to flow. In general, what you need to do is build in what are called standard contractual clauses into your contracts with your European suppliers or your European customers to allow the data to move back and forth. Okay, so that's really, really important. It's actually a fairly simple fix. You can go on the ICO website, they have a draft clause. The ICO is the data protection regulator, for those of you who don't know, and you can put in the details, and hopefully they'll come up with something fairly standard that you'll be able to slot into your contracts. But you would need to change those to make sure that the data can continue to flow from the EU to the UK in the case that we left with no deal. The second thing to say about data is that as part of our membership of the European Union, we have what are called Adequacy Agreements with 12 countries outside the European Union. And so at the moment, we have the same data arrangements with those 12 countries as we do with European Union member states. Okay, so these 12 countries, which I'll read off in a second, it's a bit of a funny list. These 12 countries, for this, you'd have to do exactly the same thing, which is make sure that the legal basis of your data transfers, i.e. your contracts, were changed accordingly to make sure that you would allow the data to flow. So the 12 countries are, I'll read them off, but there's a link in the document that to the list here, is Andorra, Argentina, Canada, the Faroe Islands, Guernsey, Israel, the Isle of Man, Japan, Jersey, New Zealand, Uruguay, and then the United States, which has a special status called the Privacy Shield, which means that you'll have to register with the US Department of Commerce. Again, the link is in the document to make sure that you're able to continue to move data accordingly. So that's the big things on data flows. And I realize that's super technical and I've whizzed through it in about 3 minutes, but I'm happy to answer any questions at the end. Second thing is immigration. And this is probably the biggest topic that we've had the most questions about. And the reason why is we're well aware that actually this isn't just a question of sort of legal status of people, it's actually in many ways it's their lives, right? And there's a lot of European founders in the UK, there's a lot of European staff that you guys might have, and they're like really uncertain and unsure of what their legal status is going to be, how they're going to live here, what they're going to do. The biggest thing that you can do to reassure them is make sure that they apply early, as quickly as they can, for the Home Office scheme called Settled Status, which will guarantee their rights moving forward. Okay, so if what you need to do is, in a case of a no-deal exit, they have to apply for settled status before December 2020. But the sooner they can do that, the better. And the reason for that is, to be totally frank, you only have to look at the news reports to see how often the Home Office can balls up immigration policy in various ways. Okay, and they're not perfect. We know that there are going to be challenges, and we know there are going to be issues with clarifications required, with additional documents required. It's not theoretically a simple process can become quite complicated. So it's really, really important that you make sure, for the sake of clarity for your staff and oftentimes for yourselves, that they apply for this status, which is completely free, as soon as they possibly can, and then you can help them through that process and encourage them to apply. And then if they need additional documentation, they might require it from you as an employer, so helping them with that as much as you can would be the best thing to do. 2 additional things to flag on immigration. The first is, what happens if a European comes into the UK after we've left the European Union with no deal? They'll have to sign up for what's called temporary leave to remain, which would allow them, it's a 3-year temporary immigration status, 36 months temporary immigration status. So they would apply for this temporary leave to remain, that would be granted, and then they would be given 3 years to clarify their longer term immigration status under that situation. So basically they'd have to be moved on to some other kind of visa after that. And then the final thing, and this is more of a you guys going to Europe thing, is in the case that you're doing business trips to the European Union after we leave the European Union with no deal, you'd have to make sure that you are allowed formally to do business in that country under the terms of whatever, however you are transing there. So I'll give the example of, I used to work in India, and for me to do business in India, I had to have a business visa to go there, right? And we don't know exactly what will happen with European Union member states once we leave the EU, because they could all apply their immigration rules differently. But basically, in a scenario where, say, we left on October the 31st and you're planning a business trip to Berlin on the 6th of November, I'd keep an eye on it, because the reality is you don't know exactly what status will be required. There was a story out at the weekend that, understanding how you would transport equipment, things like laptops or whatever, to do business there would also require additional details. So those kind of things you just have to be super, super aware of, and that there might be additional complications added, and we genuinely don't know what complications they might be yet. So you're just going to have to keep an eye on it as you're moving forward. So they're the three things on immigration. The next thing is Horizon 2020 and R&D funding. And so, for those of you that don't know, Horizon 2020 is essentially the European funding mechanism for innovative research. So quite a lot of startups, particularly the guys certainly in Sheffield who are doing the really exciting stuff on advanced manufacturing, for example, are oftentimes doing so through grant funding that comes from the European Union through the Horizon 2020 scheme, particularly on the more innovative research projects. Okay? The good thing about this is that, and actually the government reaffirmed this commitment today, they're committed to funding everything that has already been approved through the Horizon 2020 scheme. Okay? So if you currently have just been approved for funding but you haven't got it from the European Union, the government has committed to funding that work. If you've put in an application but you've not yet heard whether you're going to get it or not from the European Union, they will automatically be judged by UKRI, the UK Research and Innovation Council, so that they will make their own decision on it. So basically it will just be immediately transferred over, so instead of a European body making the decision, the UK body will make the decision. But the main thing is that you have to register your project on the UKRI portal. Again, the link is in the document under section 10, and just make sure that the details are in there so you can follow up accordingly with UKRI about your bid to make sure that you're getting the money that you should be getting, basically. So they're the top three things that we've consistently heard about. And then one of the things that I've been sort of explaining to people is, because the biggest question that we've got throughout this process is, well, we heard that we had to prepare an awful... Okay, actually, a quick question. How many people, just show of hands, how many people have put any preparations in place so far? Yeah, 3, 4. That's roughly what we've had in general so far, so like a small minority. And the questions that we've been asked a lot is sort of, either we did all this stuff for March and then it was pointless and we wasted all our time and effort and it's very frustrating, or is this going to happen anyway? Who knows? And so I thought one of the things that we've done to be helpful is we're trying to sketch out what the politics look like, what the political situation is broadly, and why it's important to be preparing accordingly, okay? So, and I was laughing because the first time I did this talk was the day that the Supreme Court ruled that Parliament's prorogation was illegal. So trying to explain the politics of that 30 minutes before that actually happened was quite difficult. But the fundamental is that whatever the noise, whatever the conversation, whether that's in Parliament, whether that's in Brussels, which is where the discussion will be going next week for the European Council, at the moment, the default option remains that we leave with no deal on the 31st of October. That is the default option, okay? And I think that the most important thing to say about that is I'll explain a little bit about what the Prime Minister is trying to do and based on the conversations. I've been at all 3 party conferences over the course of the last month, having a lot of discussions with both folks in government and elsewhere about the broad plans that the government's sketching going forward. But like, all of these plans have holes in them, as we can see from how it's been going thus far. And any time that that it fails within this process, there is a real risk of no deal that we have to mitigate. So what is the government's plan going forward? You've seen Boris Johnson put out his proposals on the Irish border in the last week. They've been met with, I think it's fair to say, scepticism from the European Union. The main reason being that the Irish government, absolute red line is there will be no border checks on the island of Ireland, and the proposals include border checks on the island of Ireland. And so at the moment there is sort of a trap in deadlock where Parliament is saying that they want to block no deal. The Prime Minister is still theoretically committed to finding a workaround to ensure that no deal would happen on the 31st. And there's no majority in Parliament for anything other than a vote to block no deal, but there's no vote for a deal, and even the deal that's on the table at the moment isn't acceptable to the Europeans. So we're in a bit of a loop. And at any point in that process, if nothing happens between now and October the 31st, there will be no deal. But it's clear that the Prime Minister's intention for all of the strong language is ultimately, and this is the position that's become increasingly clear over the last week, is ultimately unlikely to result in him committing to no deal. Because apart from anything else, it seems at this point that it would be unlawful to pursue that. Okay? So what's most likely to happen is some form of extension. But at that point, you're going to have an extension with a view to an election, which Boris Johnson would hopefully at that point win in his mind, right? He'll think, I will win this election. And then he would have a parliamentary majority to pursue whatever kind of exit he wanted. And at the moment, the deal on the table is unacceptable to the European Union. So the other default option, which he says he is committed to pursuing, is no deal. So we'll end up, for all the process, exactly back where we are at the moment, having gone through an election period which theoretically Boris Johnson thinks he's going to win. Now, like, the reason why I sketch all of that out is because there are an awful lot of elements of preparation in this document. You know, if you're a goods trader and you have to stockpile goods, right, that's much, much more problematic, and there's essentially questions of your cash flow as to whether or not you can prepare appropriately. But in the cases of things like immigration status, in the cases of things like data flows, these are all preparations that you can start putting in place now that will work whether we are in this position now, in a month's time, in 3 months' time, in 6 months' time, and they are appropriate from a business risk perspective, purely from like covering yourselves against a business risk like you would buy insurance, to make sure that you can do in order to better protect yourselves in the case of the genuine uncertainty that sort of a situation like this is causing. So I'll leave it there. I realise every time I give this talk, I come in and everyone just looks super depressed after I finish. I spread sheer gloom every single time I come into a room. But we're more than happy to take any questions. Like I said, we have lawyers in the room as well. We have Paul from DCMS. If you have any questions on the rest of the document, do let us know. Like I said, we'll be totally honest about where we don't have answers and where we do have answers. But yeah, thanks very much. And do we have any questions?